Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author, and PhD in Spanish and French literature. I am also the person who did a lecture on the 100 best books of the 21st century, according to the New York Times, and promptly forgot that I told you all that I would also do a short lecture on the 10 books that I would have sent in if the New York Times had asked me. For those of you who were not super obsessive about that list as it was coming out and who did not get into the nitty-gritty about their selection process, I'll just fill you in very briefly. They asked 503 different people, novelists, poets, literary enthusiasts, librarians, nonfiction writers, a whole swath of people. You can actually look at the list online. I have not actually done that. They asked all of those 503 people to send in their 10 favorite books of the 21st century. People were allowed to interpret favorite in any way they wanted. They mentioned that someone just thought it was the best book that they had read, and someone else believed that it was something that would really endure. They also then gave anyone who wanted to participate, of the 503, they were given a survey where 2 titles would pop up, just randomly generated, and they would choose which one they liked better. So the statistics people over at the Times did some sort of statistical magic with all of that and came up with the list. Frankly, I think it was a genius move in terms of publicity. Just this idea of slowly meting out all of these favorites and sort of working toward what the number one favorite was going to be. I then mentioned that to one of my kids and my husband, and they were like, oh my God, everyone does that, like on sports things and music. You know, this is apparently like some sort of system that lots of people use for marketing. I think the Times really did a good job taking advantage of it. So what I'm going to do today is go through, in no special order, just a totally random order, the 10 books that I would have sent in had the Times asked. I'm also going to include 5 runners up because I just could not, in fact, rule 5 of these out. I am not going to be able to put them in order because that would just be too difficult. Outside of To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf and maybe Lolita by Nabokov, outside of those 2 books, it's totally impossible for me to rank things. So, you know what? Actually, I'm going to try. I'm going to go through these in no particular order, just to give you a very little brief idea of why I love each one. I'm actually then going to read the first sentence of each of these, just to give you a sense of the absolute genius. I'm going to try very hard to then not dive in deep and, just analyze the shit out of every single one of those first sentences. But I think I'll be able to do that. And then at the end, I'm going to try hard to put them in order. It's going to be very exciting. I've decided this right now on the fly. I'm going to start with number 10 and work toward number 1. And honestly, guys, while we are on statistics, I just wanted to share with you, I finally figured out how to look at my metrics from the Fox Page podcast a little more carefully. And I have had 17,700 listeners over the course of the past year. And those listeners have listened to 49,054 episodes. I'm really so appreciative. It's, just a labor of love over here. I'm just really, really enjoying every minute. But it is so nice to know that literally almost 18,000 people out there are also tuning in. The first title we are looking at here is Ben Lerner's Leaving the Atocha Station. I loved this book so much. Ben Lerner is this kind of very cerebral, I think really insightful and incredibly incisive writer. He, I've said this before, feels a little bit like David Foster Wallace to me, but like David Foster Wallace with a little bit less navel-gazing and a little more warmth to it. I like Leaving the Atocha Station even more than 1004. 1004 was the book that the Times chose, or that people chose for the Times 100. But Leaving the Atocha Station, I think part of my draw to it is that it has a huge amount to do with language. It is set in Madrid, which is, a city after my own heart, given that I do have a doctoral degree in Spanish literature. And I really loved that focus on language. 1004, I think, is more accessible and in some ways more interesting to dive into with a general population. But Leaving the Atocha Station, oh my gosh, for anyone who is traveling to Spain or any place where they don't speak English, it's really an incredibly brainy and interesting look at language, but I really, really loved this book. As promised, I'm going to open up Leaving the Atocha Station and read the first sentence. The first phase of my research involved waking up weekday mornings in a barely furnished attic apartment, the first apartment I'd looked at after arriving in Madrid, or letting myself be woken by the news from La Plaza Santa Ana, failing to assimilate that noise fully into my dream, then putting on the rusty stovetop espresso machine and rolling a spliff while I waited for the coffee. So you can tell right from the start, there's a lot of kind of minutia. There's a lot of description. There's a lot of very detailed, but very kind of mundane. And frankly, I don't know how he makes it all so interesting. It feels a little bit like Karl Ove Knausgaard. And in fact, much like Karl Ove Knausgaard, there is a real temptation to conflate Ben Lerner and any of the heroes of his stories. And I think you are welcome to do that. I think he encourages that on some level. And it just makes the work so interesting. Oh my gosh, the next one I'm pulling off the pile here is Deadwood. I actually, those of you on YouTube can tell that I maybe just got my haircut. I was just talking to my haircutter guy practically the whole time about Deadwood and what an incredible, in fact, and just like insanely great television adaptation there is. He did not know, many people don't, that Deadwood was a novel first. This book by Pete Dexter is incredible. It's so full of love and it's so broad reaching, and you have this depth and this sense of like really, really knowing these people. Plus it's fun if you can picture Timothy Oliphant. But for all you dudes out there, or for anyone, in fact, who wants like a Western moment, it goes so far beyond just being a Western, but it really, really is an incredible, incredible book. And here is the first sentence of Deadwood. The boy shot Wild Bill's horse at dusk, while Bill was off in the bushes to relieve himself. It was lucky for everybody but the horse that it happened when it did, but not so lucky it had to be God's hand in it. It always took Bill a while in the bushes. It wasn't dusk when he'd gone in there, and things have to happen sometime. You will notice that I could not stop. I couldn't stop at the first sentence. I had to go ahead and read the whole first paragraph. This first paragraph is a really good indication of the kind of sense of like being told a good old-fashioned story by a good old-fashioned third-person omniscient narrator. But it also tells you of the kind of intimacy. I mean, we're seeing Wild Bill Hickok here, who is in fact a historical figure, and he is clearly having, you know, some like enlarged prostate issues off in the bushes. And we have this really momentous action that's happening. Someone shot his horse. All sorts of mayhem is going to ensue. But Pete Dexter is so good at both focusing on that mayhem, but also giving us these very quiet moments that allow us to have so much good feeling and so much sympathy toward all of these different people. It is so good. Deadwood is so good. Oh my God. The next book is Milkman by Anna Burns. So this was the one that really kicked off my whole obsession with Irish literature. This book, it's not short. It's a pretty thick book. And let me tell you, it is a very intense read. This is a book that I actually was reading faster than normal, in part because, well, I've read it twice now. The first time I read it, I really did find myself kind of like reading quickly through it because it was taut enough that I was like, oh God, I don't know how long I can be in this kind of intensity. The second time, perhaps because I really knew how the whole thing was going to play out, the second time I was able to slow down and appreciate Anna Burns a little more. I'm also going to just say that the most exciting moment thus far in the history of the Foxed page is that the Anna Burns commented on my lecture on Milkman, saying that it was very detailed and that she was going to certainly subscribe. And I was like, oh my God, is this the Anna Burns? And then like a month later, she wrote back, in fact, that it was an Anna Burns. And she said that she was, in fact, about to listen to another lecture after she went into like a wee rainstorm or something. So I'm very proud of the fact that Anna Burns was appreciative of my analysis of her book. But first and foremost, this is just an incredibly interesting look at the Troubles. It has a woman at the center of the whole thing. The prose is so inventive and so interesting. Not only did I get obsessed with all of Irish literature, but I went on to read all of Anna Burns's novels, and they are all incredible. Here is the doozy of an opener to Milkman. The day somebody McSomebody put a gun to my breast and called me a cat and threatened to shoot me was the same day the milkman died. I'm so tempted to keep reading, but I'm not going to. I mean, that is an unbelievable first sentence. Talk about action. We have this somebody McSomebody, so, you know, we're clearly situated in Ireland here, putting a gun to her breast. We realize very soon that it is, in fact, a woman. And we have this person threatening to shoot this young woman. So this is, I mean, we are starting off with a bang. And let me tell you, the tension, in fact, does not let up. It's such an incredible look at what it is to live a life in a world that is full of tension. And it's not like all drudgery. In fact, it's so beautiful. And you're so attached to so many of these people, and you feel like you are learning so much. It's just an absolutely incredible accomplishment. Oh boy, we are moving from one really intense book to another. This is Valeria Luiselli's Lost Children Archive. This book, I think maybe the reason why it wasn't on the list, frankly, is because it's a challenge. I'm not going to lie. It's not an easy book to read, both because it is very dark in many ways, but also because of its structure. So in many ways, the book itself is an archive. I was fascinated by the archival nature of the book, and then there are several different archives that the different characters are also building. So you have this beautiful sense of this kind of mirroring of successive archives, but also it is talking about the immigration experience, and specifically the experience of immigrating from Mexico. And there are a few children that are involved in the story, which makes it absolutely gut-wrenching. But I will tell you, the structure and this archival thing is only the beginning of the incredible care with which Luiselli has put this together. The plot, you don't even really know like how genius the plot is until all of these different threads come together in this incredible climax. I can actually remember it, which is weird because, you know, my memory is so bad, but I have a very, very clear picture of when all of these different motifs sort of coalesce into this experience, both for the characters, but also for the reader, that is unbelievable. It says right here it's a novel, and it is in fact a novel, but there is so much of this that you can tell that Luiselli is pulling from real life, that it is almost a book that feels like it is nonfiction. I mean, there's certainly novelistic elements, but I think we are really invited to see Luiselli as an actual character and to really understand that the experience of immigration, which she is detailing so incredibly, is one that she absolutely means to be highlighting in this text so that we can understand it. I mean, we cannot even come close to understanding it, but the details and the character development and simply the trajectory of the events that happen in the book are such that you at least feel like you are getting a tiny, tiny bit of understanding of a situation that is really urgent. It actually just took me a while to get to the first sentence of the Lost Children Archive because, in fact, there is so much frontis matter. That is so fascinating. I was tempted to really dig into the frontis matter. But here is the first sentence. Departure. Mouths open to the sun, they sleep. Boy and girl, foreheads pearled with sweat, cheeks red and streaked white with dry spit. They occupy the entire space in the back of the car, spread out, limbs offering heavy and placid. Again, I couldn't just read the first sentence there, but it gives you a sense of how personal this story is, even though it is the story of many, many people. Valeria Luiselli is unbelievable. The next book is The Passenger by Cormac McCarthy. I really loved The Road, but that is a book I cannot return to because, in fact, I found it so harrowing. I think I mentioned that before. The Passenger, on the other hand, and Stella Maris, I actually thought this was my copy that had both, but I think I have several copies, and this one happens to only be of The Passenger. What I loved the most, in fact, about The Passenger and Stella Maris is that after a long hiatus of not publishing anything, Cormac McCarthy came out with these two novels in fairly quick succession, and one of them really focused on a woman. And I loved the idea of finally, you know, in his 11th hour, he was really bringing a woman to the fore in a way that I found incredibly compelling. I'm actually endorsing two books here. I think in many ways you should read, you shouldn't do anything, but the idea of The Passenger together with Stella Maris is the way I think to most fully appreciate just the absolute genius of the very, very late Cormac McCarthy. I mean, he's also like the late Cormac McCarthy, but I mean like the late work by Cormac McCarthy. Here's the opening sentence. It had snowed lightly in the night, and her frozen hair was gold and crystalline, and her eyes were frozen cold and hard as stones. Oh my God, you guys, I'm just like, it's all I can do to not break this down. There is so much here in terms of polysyndeton, which is using and. There's so much here with adjectives. It's a very like Hemingway-esque kind of start. Obviously, this like harrowing picture of this frozen woman is really indelible right from the start. I mean, I really did love these books. The next book is Foster by Claire Keegan. I really loved all three of hers. The only thing that is sad for me about Claire Keegan is that she is so slow in writing that I am afraid we are going to have to wait a very long time before we are going to have more of her work. So I really loved the idea of small things like these being included in the 100 best books. I think in some ways, I think they have, actually, I like them equally. But I will say that Foster, for me, it was the book that I read first. But it also has a subtlety to it that makes for an even more satisfying deep dive. So it is a book that I think is deceivingly simple, meaning that it seems kind of simple, but there is a huge amount going on. This is a book that is so full of symbolism and figurative language in general, but especially symbolism. It is so rife with all these incredibly meaningful details that it's astonishing. I will also say sometimes figurative language and especially symbolism can start to feel a bit heavy-handed, and there's just never, ever a misstep in these slim novellas. Here is the opening to Foster. Early on a Sunday, after the first Mass in Clonigal, my father, instead of taking me home, drives deep into Wexford towards the coast where my mother's people came from. I mean, again, it's all I can do. It's all I can do to move on to the next. Okay, oh my gosh, and the next is actually an excellent one to move on to. It is, in fact, Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders. This was one that was just very solidly on the other list, and I was so happy. I mean, in many ways, I'm tipping my hand here. In many ways, I think this should be the best book of the 21st century, and it is one that I wish had been number one on the New York Times list, partially because George Saunders, part of my feeling is that he would deserve that kind of an accolade because his body of work is so impressive. It is diverse and interesting. All of the quality is so excellent, but this book is singular. It's just unbelievable. I like the idea of it being, somewhat of a kind of a historical fiction situation here, because we are obviously dealing with one of the presidents and with a chapter of that presidential life that we know a bit about, but not a lot. But I love everything about this. As with all George Saunders, it is inventive and warm and hilarious. This book is kind of like less deranged and kind of unhinged than some of his other work, but I just absolutely love everything about this. We get to dive in and treat ourselves to a tiny bit of George Saunders here. On our wedding day, I was 46, she was 18. Now, I know what you are thinking. Older man, not thin, somewhat bald, lame in one leg, teeth of wood, exercises the marital prerogative, but that is false. It's a tiny bit misleading because, in fact, we think maybe that he is talking about President Lincoln in the very beginning, and in fact, he is not. Which is really one of the most important parts of this novel. Clearly, Lincoln and his son are at the center of the thing, but the vast number of characters is so impressive, and their voices are so distinguishable in many ways. He does that cool thing where he has long passages and only attributes the speaker at the very end, which I think some people find unsettling, certainly. But this book is a challenge that a reader should, expect to rise to, and I just love everything about it. Okay, we're now moving on to Circe by Madeline Miller. I love this book so much. If we are talking about a book that we recommended a lot and that we just loved reading and rereading and that was just like an incredible pleasure, Circe is, in fact, that book for me. It's a retelling, obviously, of the myth of Circe. I am not a mythology person. I knew very little about mythology. And let me tell you, Madeline Miller just really changed my mind on that whole entire front. I found this so engaging and so immediate and so contemporary in so many ways that I was like, wait, I could totally handle mythology if it was all going to read like this. So we're going to look at the very first sentence of Circe. When I was born, the name for what I was did not exist. They called me nymph, assuming I would be like my mother and aunts and 1,000 cousins. Least of the lesser goddesses, our powers were so modest they could scarcely ensure our eternities. Unbelievable. I mean, this is like just the magic of it and the simplicity of the prose. It's too good. Okay, the next one is the only nonfiction book that I chose, Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Beautiful Struggle. I really love the idea of Between the World and Me as being on the list, and in some ways I think that's a slightly farther reaching book, and in some ways I think it's kind of the better constructed book, but I love this so much. It is definitely a coming-of-age story, and there is something about Ta-Nehisi Coates speaking about his family of origin and the way that he grew up that I found so incredibly compelling. Of course, there is also here language that is unparalleled. It's just so beautiful. So here is the first line of Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Beautiful Struggle. Chapter 1. There lived a little boy who was misled. When they caught us down on Charles Street, they were all that I'd heard. They did not wave banners, flash amulets, or street signs. Still, I could feel their awful name advancing out of the lore. In some ways, this kind of younger boy's vision of the world around him is such an incredible, vulnerable, and really endearing and very intimate voice. And I loved everything about this. We're now coming I can barely lift this book up. It's so heavy. Look at this. This is called Ducks Newburyport by Lucy Ellmann. I loved this book so much. This book is challenging not only because it is gigantic, but also because it has a very specific textual thing happening. There are parts where there is a wild creature that you are following occasionally. It's the catamount. It's a very large cat up in Massachusetts, which is really reminding me of Northwoods. Honestly, guys, I have Northwoods sitting here. Oh, it almost made my runners-up. I really, really loved that book. Wait, maybe it did make my runners-up. I'm looking at my runners-up category and I can't quite see it there. Oh, it did. I can see the paw of the catamount. Okay, good. Apparently, we have 2 books set in Massachusetts that both involve catamounts that are in my top favorite 15 books of the century. So when we are following the catamount, we have an omniscient narrator. But aside from that, in the remaining pages of this 1,000-page book, every single sentence begins the fact that. It sounds like it would be really tedious, and I think for some people it was a little bit difficult, but I watched this like a tightrope act. I just couldn't get enough of it, and partially because you sort of forget. Like, the prose is so good, and it's so absorbing and so incredible that you really do forget that there's this kind of textual choice that she is making. I loved everything about this book. In some ways it's very quiet, which is kind of weird because it is 1,000 pages long, but I loved it. I loved it. I am going to admit right now I have not gone back for a second read just because it's such a commitment. But if you're looking for something really long to sink yourself into, and if you're up for a bit of a challenge, Ducks Newburyport is amazing. For the runners-up, I'm just going to hold them up. Say the name for you. So the first, in no particular order, is Margaret the First by Danielle Dutton. This is a book that hasn't gotten a ton of attention. I loved it. It's slim. It's so, so good. The next is The Anthologist, which is the first novel in the Paul Chowder Chronicles by Nicholson Baker. I did a lecture on it. I love Nicholson Baker so much. This is absolutely in my top 15. Then we have Lori Moore Bark. I love Lori Moore so much. She is a short fiction writer, although she does have one book called Who Will Run the Frog Hospital, which I love, but unfortunately that was published before the year 2000. This is a more recent collection of hers, and I really love it. She is so incisive and so funny and so good. I tend to not just gravitate right towards short fiction, but if I were more of a short fiction reader, I just think this would have made the top 10. Lori Moore is so smart and so good. Okay, the next is All Fours by Miranda July. I really, really loved this book. I did a lecture on it. I might be a little starry-eyed and might be a little bit biased because it is newer and so it's sort of fresh in my mind. But I also am so impressed by the idea that she really tackled perimenopause in a way that is funny and real and startling and super graphic in terms of the sexual content. It is so good. I have also had more conversations with readers about this book than any other book in a long, long time. It is making a very, very large impact. If you haven't read it, you absolutely should. And in fact, all you dudes out there, I would really recommend that you pick up All Fours if you have any women in your life. Here is the other book with the catamount that is set in Massachusetts. I love Daniel Mason's Northwoods. It's so good. And in many ways, it has some echoes, in fact, of Lincoln and the Bardo. It involves some ghosts at different points, but it also has an incredible breadth. It's historical, and it's just beautiful, beautiful prose. I loved this book. Then, again, in no particular order, the last of the runners-up is, in fact, James by Percival Everett. I really appreciated the rewriting of Huckleberry Finn, but even if I didn't know Huckleberry Finn, I really would have loved this book. For any of you who've read James and haven't listened to the lecture, I did do an enriched read lecture about Huckleberry Finn and James. I loved everything about this, the humor, the inventiveness, the perspective. I loved everything about it. Okay, I said I wasn't going to do it, but I am. I'm just going to whip back through these 10, and I'm doing it in order. I just put them in order. It was a very interesting experiment, actually, to have 2 titles and decide which one I liked better, because in fact, that was very clarifying. Things got very clear for me here. So here, number 10, in position number 10 is Circe by Madeline Miller. Number 9, The Lost Children Archive by Valeria Luiselli. Number 8, Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Beautiful Struggle. Number 7, Deadwood by Pete Dexter. Number 6, Leaving the Atocha Station. That was a bit of a surprise for me, but I stand by it. Number 5 is Ducks Newburyport by Lucy Ellman. Number 4, The Passenger and Stella Maris by Cormac McCarthy. 3 is Milkman by Anna Burns. Number 2, Foster by Claire Keegan. And then my favorite book of the past century is absolutely Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders. So I hope that you enjoyed this quick little dash through the books that I would have sent to the New York Times had they asked me. I'm really happy to share them all with you. Happy reading!